Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It started with a question. A simple one, but it lingered in my mind, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. What if you could read your own life, every step, every choice, as if it were a story? Would you dare to finish it, knowing what might be waiting for you on the last page? I had found the book by accident. It was tucked away on the top shelf of an old bookstore, hidden behind rows of dusty novels. The leather cover was worn, the edges of the pages yellowed with age. But something about it drew me in. Something in the weight of it, like it held a secret, a story that was meant for me. The title was simple, almost too simple, My Life, written in faded gold letters across the spine. At first, I thought it was just another one of those self-help books, but when I flipped it open, I realized that it wasn't. This wasn't a guide to living, it was a record, a chronicle of everything that had ever happened to me. Every moment, every decision, laid out in perfect detail. My childhood, my mistakes, my triumphs, my fears, it was all there, as if someone had been watching, writing it down for me to read. At first, it was fascinating. I read it in silence, letting the words wash over me, until I came to a part that felt strange. It was a moment from my past, one I hadn't thought about in years. It was detailed, so detailed that it felt like the author had been there with me, watching me. But then, the next page was blank. The next part of the story, the part that should have been there, was missing. I turned the page, feeling a chill creep up my spine. But it wasn't a page. It was just an empty space. The next page, gone. I turned back, trying to make sense of it. The rest of the book was intact, every chapter written out in fine detail. But that last page, the one that should have finished the story, was torn out. Ripped away. I tried to ignore it at first. After all, it was just a book, right? But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Why would someone tear out the last page? What had happened at the end of the story? The thought haunted me as I lay in bed that night, the moonlight casting long shadows across my room. I tried to push the thought away, but it kept coming back. What if the last page held the answer to everything? What if it told me how it all ends? The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to know. I had to find that last page, even if it meant searching every corner of the world. I needed to know what was waiting for me at the end of the story. But as the day went on, something strange began to happen. The world around me started to feel different. It wasn't just the missing page. It was the way people looked at me, the way the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. And then, the noises started. At first, it was just a faint sound. A rustling, like paper moving in the wind. I brushed it off as the sound of the house settling, but then it came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It sounded like footsteps, soft at first, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the sound grew closer, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was coming from the hallway outside my room. I slowly stood up, my breath shallow. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. And then, just as I reached for the door, there was a knock. It was light at first, barely a tap, but it echoed through the silence. I hesitated. Should I open it? Should I see who or what was on the other side? My hand hovered over the doorknob, but something held me back. The feeling of dread of something just beyond my reach pressing against me. I wasn't sure if it was real or if it was just my mind unraveling as I thought about that missing page. But I couldn't ignore it. I opened the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the silence almost unbearable. I stepped out into the hall, looking around. The air felt thick, like something was watching, waiting. My eyes darted from one end to the other, but there was no one there. No sounds, no footsteps. Just the echo of my own breath. I closed the door behind me, but the feeling lingered. I couldn't shake it, the sense that something was wrong. Something had changed. And then I heard it again. That faint rustling sound, like paper being moved. Only this time, it wasn't just a sound. It was the air around me, shifting, the temperature dropping, the walls seeming to close in on me. I turned, my heart racing. There, in the dim light of the hallway, I saw it. A shadow, faint at first, but growing clearer. It was tall, but shapeless, moving in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The shadow shifted, as if it were being pulled by something just out of sight. I took a step back, my mind racing. What was happening? Was this real? Was it part of the story? Was this the end? And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. But the rustling continued. Louder now. Closer. And the book was still there, waiting for me, the torn page beckoning. The house felt colder now. The warmth that usually settled in the corners of the rooms, even in the dead of night, had vanished. I tried to brush off the feeling of unease, but it clung to me, heavier than the air itself. The book lay on the table in front of me, the last page missing, taunting me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find it. I had to know how it ended. But as I sat there, staring at the pages, the rustling sound started again. It was subtle at first, almost like a breeze brushing through leaves. But there was no wind. No open windows. The sound came from within the walls, behind the floorboards. The faint creaking of the house seemed to echo louder than it should have. I stood up, my breath catching in my throat, every instinct telling me to leave, to run far away. But I couldn't. Not while I was so close to the answer. I walked toward the hallway, my feet dragging against the wooden floor. The house was silent, too silent, as if it was holding its breath. The shadow from before was gone, but the unsettling feeling remained. I could almost hear the walls whispering, as though they knew something I didn't. I checked every room, every corner of the house, as if searching for the missing page would somehow erase the growing dread that was wrapping itself around me. But it wasn't in any of the rooms. It wasn't under the bed or in the attic. It was nowhere. My mind raced. Where could it be? Who had taken it? And why? Suddenly, I remembered something I hadn't thought about before. The bookstore. The strange feeling I had when I first held the book. The shopkeeper, an old man with eyes that seemed too knowing, had watched me closely as I picked it up. He had said nothing, but there was something in his gaze, something that made me uneasy. Could he have known? Could he have taken the last page? Or was it something more sinister? The thought made my skin crawl. I had to go back. I had to find out what was happening, even if it meant confronting that strange old man. I grabbed my coat and hurried out of the house, the door creaking behind me like a warning. The streets were empty, save for the distant hum of traffic. The city, usually so full of life, felt hollow now, as if something was watching from the shadows. When I arrived at the bookstore, the door was ajar. It was strange, considering the place was never open this late. I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly as I entered. The shop was just as I remembered it, dimly lit, rows of books stacked haphazardly, the scent of old paper and dust filling the air. But something was different. There was a stillness to the place, a quiet that made my heart race. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. There was no answer. I took a few steps forward, my eyes scanning the shelves, looking for anything that might give me a clue. And then I saw him. The shopkeeper was standing at the far end of the store, his back to me. He was hunched over, as if he were searching for something on the floor. The moment I saw him, I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something unnatural about the way he stood, too still, too perfect. I took a hesitant step forward. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me freeze. The silence between us seemed to stretch, and I wondered if he could hear my heart pounding in my chest. "You've come for it, haven't you?" he said, his voice low and raspy. I blinked. "What?" "The last page," he continued, his lips curling into a thin smile. "It's waiting for you. You always knew it was missing, didn't you?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. How could he know? How could he know about the page? I took a step back. "Where is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached behind him and pulled out a small, weathered box. He opened it slowly, revealing a single torn piece of paper inside. The edges were frayed, the ink faded, but I could see enough to recognize the handwriting. It was mine. "This is yours," the shopkeeper said, holding the page out to me. "But be warned. Once you read it, there's no turning back. The story is already written. You can't change it." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to reach out, to take the page, but another part of me screamed not to. What if reading it meant something terrible? "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why would you keep it from me?" The old man's smile widened. "Because some stories are better left unfinished." I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the torn page. Just as my fingers brushed the edge of it, I heard a sound, soft at first, like a rustle of leaves. But it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the wind. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from all around me. The shopkeeper's face twisted into something darker. His eyes, once knowing, now gleamed with something cold, something unnatural. "Too late," he whispered, his voice a rasping growl. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the shadows growing longer. And then, just as I was about to snatch the page from his hand, everything went black. I woke with a start, gasping for air as if I had been drowning. My surroundings were unfamiliar, the air thick and cold, heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. I tried to move, but my limbs felt like they were made of lead. Panic surged within me, and I forced myself to sit up, my eyes scanning the room. It wasn't the bookstore. I wasn't even sure where I was, but one thing was clear: I was no longer in control. The walls around me were peeling, the wallpaper stained with age and neglect. I was lying on an old, worn mattress in the center of the room, and the only light came from a dim, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I reached up to rub my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering dizziness, but as I moved my hand, something caught my attention in the corner of the room. A mirror. A large, cracked mirror, standing against the wall. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it, my reflection. It wasn't me. The face staring back at me was pale, eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't just the fear in the reflection that made me freeze. It was the way it moved. My reflection didn't mirror my actions. It seemed independent. It grinned an unsettling, twisted smile and then mouthed something, but no sound came out. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? I turned away from the mirror, my breath shallow. The room was cold, but there was no escape. The door was locked, the window sealed shut. I pounded on the door, my fist bruising against the wood, but it didn't budge. Let me out. I shouted, but there was no answer. Only the echo of my own voice, bouncing off the walls. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The mirror, the reflection, it couldn't have been real. But the longer I stared at it, the more it felt like the truth. It felt like something was playing with me, something that knew my every move before I made it. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and I turned, expecting to see the shopkeeper or something worse. But instead, it was just darkness, the hallway beyond the room empty. No footsteps, no shadows, just silence. I stepped forward, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I had to find the last page. But as I moved toward the door, the sound came again. That rustling, like paper being shuffled. This time, it wasn't from the walls, it was from behind me. I turned quickly, my pulse racing, but the mirror was still there. The reflection still twisted and grinning, but now it was moving closer. It was reaching out, its fingers pressing against the glass, as if trying to escape. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the reflection's hand reached through the mirror, its fingers emerging from the cracked surface like a shadow coming to life. The glass began to ripple, distorting as if it were water. The air grew thick, heavy with the pressure of something pulling at me, dragging me toward the mirror. My body fought against it, but I felt an unnatural force, something cold and powerful, drawing me in. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My feet moved as if guided by someone else's will, inching closer to the glass. The twisted figure in the reflection smiled wider, its mouth stretching unnaturally as if it were savoring the moment. It wasn't just my reflection anymore. It was something else, something darker, something that wanted to take my place. And then, just as the cold fingers brushed my face, a loud crash rang through the room. The mirror shattered. I staggered backward, gasping for air, my body trembling from head to toe. The room was silent again, the mirror now just a pile of jagged shards on the floor. But the feeling remained, the feeling that something was still there, something watching from the fragments of glass, something that hadn't finished with me yet. I turned toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get out. I had to escape whatever this was before it swallowed me whole. As I ran down the hallway, I could feel the temperature drop. The walls seemed to close in around me, the narrow corridor stretching longer with every step I took. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind me, the sound growing louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Still, the footsteps persisted, their rhythm matching my own, as if whatever was chasing me was just out of sight, stalking me from the shadows. I reached the end of the hallway, and before I could open the door, it swung open by itself, the air inside thick with an oppressive energy. The rustling sound grew louder, closer, more urgent. Something was waiting for me in the room beyond. I stepped inside, my legs shaking beneath me. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. And there, lying in the center of the floor, was the torn page. The last page. I hesitated, my mind racing. Should I take it? Should I read it? Before I could decide, the door slammed shut behind me. And then, the whispering began. The whispering was everywhere. It came from all directions, swirling around me like an unseen storm. It was not words, not coherent sentences, but a steady murmur, like a chorus of voices just beyond hearing. I felt them, as if they were brushing against my skin, each one laced with an almost tangible malice. I turned to face the room, the torn page lying there in the center, glowing faintly in the dim light. It beckoned to me, pulling at my very soul. But I could feel it too, the weight of something watching, something waiting for me to make the wrong move. I stepped forward, my breath shallow, the air around me heavy and thick with dread. Each step I took seemed to echo louder in my ears, the whispering growing more insistent. The voices, were they speaking to me? Or were they trying to warn me? I reached down slowly, my fingers trembling as I picked up the last page. The moment my hand touched the paper, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even further, the shadows twisting unnaturally, stretching toward me as if drawn to the page. The voices grew louder, now a cacophony of whispers that reverberated through my skull. I could barely focus on the words written on the page. The ink was smudged, faded in places, but enough was legible to make my heart stop in my chest. It was my name, the same one I had been reading throughout the book. And beneath it, written in jagged, frantic handwriting, was a single line. You shouldn't have read this. The moment I read those words, the room around me seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls shook, the ground beneath my feet trembled. A deep, unnatural growl echoed from the shadows, growing louder with each passing second. The lights flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. And then, everything went dark. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, everything was swallowed by the silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on me, pushing me deeper into the void. A cold hand touched my shoulder, and I froze. I didn't dare move. The hand was ice cold, but it wasn't a hand. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been able to touch me. A presence, an entity, something not bound by the laws of the world. Its fingers curled into my skin, digging deep, as if trying to pull me into the darkness. Let me go! I shouted, my voice breaking. But it was useless. The darkness around me responded only with more whispers, louder now, each voice filled with venom, with promises of things I couldn't understand. The hand tightened its grip, and I could feel myself being dragged, pulled through the void. My legs moved on their own, stumbling, as if I were no longer in control of my body. The whispering grew frantic, now a maddened chorus of voices screaming in a language I couldn't comprehend. Their words cut into me like shards of glass, sharp and unrelenting. I fought against it, pushing with all the strength I had left, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, and the hand that held me was too powerful. It dragged me deeper into its grip, into the cold, endless black. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, a blinding light pierced through the darkness. I gasped, blinking rapidly as my vision returned. The light was harsh, burning my eyes, but it was real. It was something solid, something I could hold on to. I turned toward the light, seeing a faint outline of a figure standing in the distance. They were tall, cloaked in shadow, but there was something about them that felt familiar. Their form shifted, blurry at first, and then it sharpened. It was me. No, not me. It was a reflection, an echo of myself, standing at the edge of the light. But this version of me was different. The eyes staring back were dark, hollow, filled with an emptiness I couldn't comprehend. This version of me smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone I knew. It was the smile of something else, something that was not human. "You've come too far," the figure said, its voice a deep, guttural echo. "You should have stopped before you read it." I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. The whispers have returned, now coming from the reflection, my reflection, growing louder, more insistent. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. The reflection moved, taking a step toward me, its hand reaching out. "The story isn't over, but it's not yours to finish," it said, its voice cold and unfeeling. I felt the same cold hand again, this time on my chest, pushing me back toward the shadow. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, shrinking, pressing against my skin, as if the space itself was trying to suffocate me. And then the reflection spoke again, but this time its voice was different. It was mine. "I've been waiting for you," it whispered, as the darkness surged forward, swallowing everything around me. I gasped for air as the darkness closed in, swallowing every trace of light. The cold hand on my chest pressed harder, and I could feel it sinking through my ribs, its touch crawling into my very bones. The reflection, or whatever it was, stepped closer, its face twisted in a grotesque smile. "You should have stopped," it whispered again, but this time the words felt like a curse. "The story was never meant for you to finish." I tried to move, to scream, but no sound came. My body was frozen, caught in some unnatural grip, as if the very air around me had turned to lead. I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to reach the end. The darkness around me thickened, coiling like smoke, filling every corner, every inch of the room. I could still hear the whispers, faint, desperate, and terrifying, circling me. They weren't just voices now, they were sensations, like cold fingers brushing my skin, like teeth gnawing at my mind. They whispered of things I couldn't understand, things too terrible to even imagine. My hand shook as I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing against the torn page once more. The cold paper felt different now, more alive, as if it were pulsing with something dark, something that wanted to consume me. It wasn't just a page. It was a doorway. "You've read the story," the reflection said. "And now it's your turn to finish it. To become part of it." The words sent a chill down my spine. The darkness seemed to tighten around me, pressing in from every direction, and I knew that I was trapped. There was no escape. No way out. I stumbled back, my eyes locked on the reflection that now loomed before me. It reached out, its hand stretching toward my face, its fingers trembling with anticipation. "You're the ending," it said softly, its voice filled with satisfaction. "You always were." I felt my heart stop, and for a brief moment, I was paralyzed by the enormity of the realization. This wasn't just a story. It was my story. The book had been about me all along. Every page, every chapter had been written to lead me here, to this very moment. And now, the final page had claimed me. I tried to break free, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The reflection grinned, its eyes dark and endless, as its hand reached closer and closer to mine. And then, everything shifted. The room seemed to crumble, the walls collapsing into nothingness, and I was falling. Falling through the black void, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. My chest tightened, and for the first time, I understood the true meaning of fear. Not the fear of death, but the fear of losing yourself, of becoming something you never were meant to be. I thought I heard my name called, softly, desperately, like a faint echo from far away. But I couldn't respond. I was too far gone. The darkness was all-consuming. It wrapped around me, pulling me into its suffocating embrace until there was nothing left but silence. I don't know how long I was lost in that darkness. It felt like hours, or maybe days. Time lost all meaning. When I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in the room, no longer in that space of endless black. I was back in my own house, the pages of the book scattered across the floor around me. The torn page was in my hand once again, but this time it was different. The ink had changed. It wasn't just words now, it was something else, something that I couldn't quite understand. And as I stared at the page, the final line of the story began to form, slowly, painfully, as if it were being written in real time. It was always your choice. You were never meant to escape. The room around me seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like a heartbeat. The shadows seemed to move, whispering in the corners of my vision, but I knew that this was not the end. It was just the beginning. The page was no longer just a page. It was a part of me. The story had no end. The story would never end. And so, I was trapped. Forever. Have you ever had that feeling? The one where you know something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it? It's the sort of unease that lingers in the back of your mind, the kind that stays with you long after the moment has passed. I didn't know it then, but that feeling would become my reality. It all started on a dull Tuesday morning, the sort of day that passes without notice. The sky was gray, and the streets were empty, save for a few early risers on their way to work. I had just finished my cup of coffee and stepped out of the door, not thinking much of the day ahead. It was a routine I had done 1,000 times before, just another walk down the same street toward the same bus stop, where I would join the same crowd of strangers. But that day, there was someone new. At first, I didn't notice him. He was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, near the corner where the streetlights flickered. A man, perhaps in his 50s, dressed in a long, weathered coat. His hair was disheveled, and his face was pale, almost as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. I didn't think much of it. People stand on street corners all the time. I barely glanced in his direction, absorbed in the hum of the city around me. But as the days went by, I started seeing him more. He was always there, standing in the same spot, eyes locked on the flow of people as they passed by, never speaking, never moving. Just watching. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. But then I realized it wasn't. Every time I walked down that street, he was there, always in the same position, as if waiting for something or someone. It wasn't until the third day that I noticed something strange. A man who had been walking in front of me, heading toward the bus stop, stopped just short of the corner. He looked at the stranger for a moment, then took a hesitant step forward, as if drawn by some unseen force. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right?" The man in the coat didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He just continued to watch, his gaze never leaving the crowd. The other man took another step forward, his face growing more confused, more nervous. I said, "Are you all right?" he asked again, this time a bit louder. It was then that something happened, something I couldn't explain. The man in the coat vanished. There was no puff of smoke, no strange noise, just a sudden absence. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, as if he had never existed. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing in my chest. I glanced around, confused, looking for any sign of what had just happened. But the street was just as it had always been, quiet, ordinary, except for the now very startled man who had spoken to the stranger. He was gone too. I looked at the spot where they had been standing. Nothing. The street remained empty, just a few cars passing by, the usual sounds of the city humming in the distance. But something had changed. There was a thick, unsettling silence that hung in the air, as if the world had just held its breath. I shook my head, telling myself it was a trick of the mind, a passing illusion. People disappear all the time, don't they? Maybe the man had just walked away after talking to the stranger. Maybe the other man had simply decided to take another route. But as the day wore on, the thought gnawed at me. What had really happened? Where had they gone? That evening, as I made my way home, I noticed something else. The man in the coat was there again. But this time, he was watching me. I felt the weight of his gaze, cold and unblinking. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickened my pace, eager to get away from him, but my steps seemed too slow, as if my legs were made of stone. It was as if he knew me, as if he had been waiting for me. I didn't dare look back. The thought of speaking to him, of acknowledging him, terrified me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for me if I did. The next day, the man wasn't at his usual spot. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment, as if something inside me had been expecting him to return. And when he didn't, I thought perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe he had been just another part of the city's strange and unnoticed fabric, a passing figure with no more significance than a street lamp or a garbage can. But as I turned the corner at the end of the street, I saw him again. Not at the corner where he always stood, but standing in the middle of the sidewalk, blocking my path. His gaze was fixed on me, and I could feel the weight of it on my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should speak, if I should run, or if I should just stand there and wait for whatever would happen next. And then, without a word, he stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I froze, rooted to the spot, unable to move. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look away. His presence was suffocating, his silence louder than any words could be. The moment stretched on, the world around us fading into the background, until he spoke, his voice barely a murmur. "Don't speak to me." And then, before I could react, the world went dark. I woke up on the cold pavement, my body sore, my mind foggy. I didn't remember falling, but my hands were scraped and bruised, and my heart was racing as though I'd just run a marathon. It was nighttime now, and the streetlights above flickered ominously, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the man standing in front of me, his eyes never leaving mine, his words ringing in my ears. Don't speak to me. But I had spoken, hadn't I? My mouth had opened. I had. My breath caught in my throat as the memory of the cold silence flooded back. The feeling of being trapped, frozen in place, the weight of his gaze. Had he done something to me? Had he made me fall? I tried to push myself up, but my legs felt weak as if they had been drained of energy. My body ached, and I could feel the chill of the night creeping into my bones. It wasn't right. Nothing felt right. I stood slowly, taking a few unsteady steps. The street was empty now. Not a soul in sight. It was as if the whole world had disappeared, leaving me alone in the quiet, empty city. I glanced around, but there was no sign of the man. No trace of his presence, not even a shadow. The air felt unnaturally still. The usual sounds of the city, cars, voices, distant music, faded into a deafening silence. I reached for my phone, but when I looked at the screen, it was black. No signal. No battery. Nothing. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had to get home. I had to get away from whatever this was, from whatever that man was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond what I could understand. I turned down the street, heading toward the main road where I knew I would find more people. But as I walked, the city seemed to grow quieter and quieter, the buildings around me towering, yet empty, their windows dark and lifeless. I couldn't help but feel as though something was watching me from every direction, though every street was empty, every alley deserted. It was then that I heard it. A soft whisper, so faint it was almost imperceptible. It seemed to come from all around me, curling through the air like smoke. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then, it grew louder, clearer. Don't talk to him. Don't speak to the man. I froze. The voice was cold, distant, like an echo of something I couldn't see. The words felt like a warning, but it was too late. Hadn't I already spoken to him? Hadn't I already done what I was told not to do? A movement caught my eye. A shadow, just at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Only an empty street. My pulse quickened, and I hurried my steps, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I should have gone straight home. I should have left well enough alone. The whispering grew louder again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. There were many voices, overlapping, as if the city itself was murmuring in my ear. He watches. He waits. He will take you next. I looked around, but still, no one was there. No one was speaking. It was as if the voices came from within my own mind, weaving together into a sinister chorus that was too real to ignore. I could feel it then, the presence of something unseen, something close. It wasn't just the whispering. It was the air around me, the way it seemed to press in, heavy and suffocating. It was the feeling of being haunted. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart in my throat. But no one was there. The street was still empty. But the footsteps, slow, deliberate, continued, getting closer. I started to walk faster, then broke into a run, my feet slapping the pavement as I tried to outrun whatever was following me. The footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder, faster. My breath was ragged, my legs burning, but no matter how quickly I ran, the footsteps never stopped. I dared to glance over my shoulder. And there he was. The man in the coat. standing in the middle of the street, watching me. His pale face, his cold, unblinking eyes. He wasn't moving, but somehow he was closer now, as if the space between us had collapsed. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words stuck in my throat. There was no one to hear. The city was silent again, dead silent. And then, with a single, deliberate step, he began to walk toward me. I didn't wait. I couldn't wait. Without thinking, I turned and ran again, my feet pounding the ground as the world seemed to blur around me. The cold wind bit at my face, and the shadows stretched, growing longer, swallowing the street in darkness. The footsteps behind me grew faster. He was gaining on me. I could feel it, his presence, closing in, wrapping around me like a noose. I had to get away. I had to. Bang! A door slammed open ahead of me, and I skidded to a halt, my breath coming in desperate gasps. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from within. It was a man, dressed in an old suit, his face hidden by the shadows. But as he stepped forward, I could feel a sudden wave of warmth wash over me. "Come inside," he said, his voice low, barely audible. Quickly. I didn't hesitate. I rushed toward the door, the feeling of the man in the coat still looming behind me, as if his eyes were locked on my back. I stepped inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The silence inside was just as suffocating, but at least it felt safe, protected. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, trying to steady my breath. But the man in the suit didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. "You spoke to him, didn't you?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. I nodded, fear creeping up my spine. "How did he know?" He stepped closer, his face still hidden in the shadows, and for a moment I thought I saw something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't have." The man in the doorway didn't move, didn't speak, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. It was as if every breath I took was one step closer to something I couldn't see, something I wasn't meant to understand. I pressed my back harder against the door, trying to put distance between myself and the world outside. The cold sweat on my palms made it difficult to hold myself steady. I couldn't stop shaking. "How do you know about him?" I managed to ask, my voice a whisper. The man's lips twitched slightly, a ghost of a smile. He didn't seem surprised, as though he had been expecting the question. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, and I instinctively took a step back. The silence between us felt thick, almost oppressive. "You should never speak to him," he said softly. "Not because you're afraid of him, but because the moment you do, you become a part of it." I furrowed my brow. A part of what? His eyes flickered in the dim light, and for the first time, I saw something that wasn't quite human in his gaze. A coldness that sent a chill down my spine. "The silence," he said. "The thing that watches. The thing that takes." I didn't understand. "What are you talking about? Where did he go? Why is everyone who talks to him gone?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved to the door, as though listening for something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound drifted through the cracks. A faint tapping, like fingers drumming on the other side. "You should have never walked out there. The moment you spoke to him, you sealed your fate. You invited it in." I shook my head, confusion turning to panic. "What are you saying?" I didn't know. I didn't mean to. He raised a hand, cutting me off. It doesn't matter now. You're already marked. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if someone had driven a knife into my heart. I staggered backward, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air in the room grew colder, thick with an unfamiliar weight. What does that mean? Marked? What's happening to me? My voice cracked, and I felt the panic rising, clawing at my throat. The man didn't answer, only watched, his gaze unwavering. The tapping at the door grew louder, more urgent. I could hear it now, each tap like a heartbeat, a countdown. I don't have much time, he said, his voice low, strained. You have to listen to me. You have to understand. I stepped forward, desperate. What do I need to do? Tell me. He finally moved, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me freeze. You have to leave. You can't stay here. The longer you wait, the worse it will get. The silence, it takes its toll. On your mind. On your soul. It breaks you down. I took a step back, my heart pounding. What do you mean? What happens to people who talk to him? Where do they go? The man didn't answer, but his eyes told me everything. I didn't need him to speak for me to understand. I could feel it, something was wrong with me. Something had changed the moment I spoke to that man. The air around me felt thicker, suffocating. My thoughts were muddled, my vision blurry. It was as if my reality had shifted in ways I couldn't grasp. The tapping at the door was growing louder. It was closer now, unmistakably close. A rhythmic pounding. Someone, or something, was on the other side, waiting. Without thinking, I turned toward the door, my mind a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. I reached for the handle, but the man caught my arm before I could turn it. Don't open it, he warned, his grip tight, almost painfully so. I turned to face him, my voice shaking. Why? Why can't I leave? He didn't let go of my arm. Instead, he leaned in close, his face inches from mine, his breath cold against my skin. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words felt like a hammer to my chest. Because the one who watches is already inside. A chill ran down my spine, and I jerked away from him, stumbling backward toward the door. The man didn't move to stop me this time. He just watched, his face unreadable, his eyes full of something I couldn't understand. The sound on the other side of the door intensified. A low, guttural whisper, growing louder with every passing second. The door seemed to tremble under the weight of whatever was outside, waiting. I reached for the handle again, my fingers trembling. The moment I touched it, the world around me seemed to shift. The air grew even colder, and the whispering, the tapping, it all felt as though it was coming from inside my head. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The silence in the room was suffocating, pressing in from every direction. I had to leave. I had to get out. But every instinct in me screamed not to open that door. And then, just as I was about to pull away, the door slammed open with a deafening bang. I froze. There, standing in the doorway, was the man in the coat. His face was still pale, his eyes still cold and unblinking, and the darkness around him seemed to pulse, to move, as though it were alive. He stepped inside. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body felt paralyzed, as if the very air had thickened around me, holding me in place. And then, The man in the suit spoke again. "Don't speak. Don't look at him." But it was too late. The man in the coat smiled. It was a thin, cruel smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. And as he stepped closer, I felt the air grow colder still. The darkness around him pressed in, suffocating, and I realized, with a sudden, terrible clarity, I had made a mistake. I had opened the door. The man in the coat was close now, his presence suffocating, as if he were a shadow made flesh. The smile on his face twisted the air around him, darkening everything it touched. I could feel it, a deep, bone-chilling cold creeping through my body, freezing me from the inside out. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, but I couldn't make a sound. It was as if the very act of speaking would summon something worse. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to scream. His eyes never left mine, cold, empty, like they were pulling me in, drawing me deeper into some dark, endless abyss. I wanted to look away. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was as though his gaze held me prisoner. "Why?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The man in the suit, who had once offered me shelter, didn't respond. He didn't even look at me anymore. His attention was fixed solely on the man in the coat, and there was something in his face now, a look of defeat, as if he had known this would happen all along. "Please," I whispered again, my eyes pleading with him. "Help me." But the man in the suit simply turned away, his shoulders slumping as though he were already surrendering to something I couldn't understand. The man in the coat took another step toward me, and I felt the temperature drop even further, until it was almost unbearable. My teeth chattered, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, his voice like ice scraping against stone. I shook my head, my thoughts racing, trying to make sense of it all. I had spoken to him. That was the only mistake I could think of. But was that truly the thing that had sealed my fate? I didn't know, I whispered. I didn't know what would happen. The man in the coat didn't answer. Instead, he extended one long, bony hand, reaching for me, his fingers impossibly pale against the darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. His hand hovered in the air for a moment before he placed it gently on my forehead. The instant his skin touched mine, I felt a wave of cold wash over me, deeper than the physical chill that had been creeping through my body. It was a coldness that reached into the core of my being, something far worse than mere temperature. It felt like time itself had frozen, like the world had been paused, and I was stuck in some terrible, inescapable moment. And then it came. A voice, soft, like a whisper, but so loud that it filled every corner of my mind. It was not my own voice, nor was it the man's. It was something else. Something older. More ancient. You spoke to him. And now, you will never leave. The words echoed through my skull, rattling my senses, making everything spin. My vision blurred, and the room seemed to warp around me. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching for something, anything to hold on to, but the air around me felt wrong, like it was made of smoke, impossible to grasp. The man in the coat smiled again, his teeth thin and sharp like a predator's. He withdrew his hand from my forehead, but the cold lingered, a constant pressure on my mind. "No one who speaks to him ever leaves," he said, his voice low and final. "Not truly. They become part of him, a part of the silence." I didn't understand. My mind was reeling. What? What does that mean? His eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something flicker behind them. A brief, fleeting glimpse of something more, something terrifyingly vast and incomprehensible. It means, he said slowly, that once you invite him in, you cannot escape. You are his now. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, trapped within the same nightmare I had invited upon myself. The man in the suit had been standing silently by, watching, waiting. But now, he moved toward me, his expression grim. He reached out as if to say something, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Instead, he simply shook his head, as if resigned to whatever fate was coming. "Do you understand now?" the man in the coat asked, his voice growing darker. The silence takes, but it never lets go. The world around me started to change. The walls seemed to stretch and melt into one another, and the room, once safe and ordinary, now felt like a tomb, closing in on me. The air was thick with an unseen presence, pressing against me from all sides. "Who? What are you?" I gasped, my voice shaking with fear. The man in the coat's smile faded, and for the first time, I saw something like a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "I am the one who watches. The one who waits. And I take what is given to me." Suddenly, I understood. He wasn't just a man. He was something older, something that had always been there, lurking on the edges of reality. Waiting for someone like me, to make the mistake of speaking to him, of acknowledging him. And now, I had become part of that waiting. The silence, the thick, suffocating silence that had followed me since I first saw him, was not an absence of sound. It was his presence, filling every corner of the world. And once it had taken you, once you had acknowledged it, it would never let you go. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me seemed to crack, the air around me vibrating with a frequency I couldn't hear but could feel deep in my chest. And then, everything went black. I don't know how much time passed. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, an endless void where even thought was swallowed by the cold. My mind spun in chaotic circles, unable to grasp anything solid, anything real. The feeling of being trapped, of being watched, gnawed at me from every direction. And yet, somewhere deep within that void, there was a flicker. A sliver of light. A whisper. I tried to reach for it, to pull myself from the abyss that had swallowed me whole, but the silence wrapped around me like chains. I could feel its weight pressing down on my chest, tightening with each breath. The longer I stayed in this place, the harder it became to remember anything, who I was, where I had been, what I had done. The only thing that remained was the heavy, oppressive stillness, like a presence that refused to leave. But then, a sound. A faint, distant tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a hard surface. It was the only thing that cut through the darkness, the only thing that anchored me to what was left of reality. The tapping grew louder, clearer. It was coming closer, inch by inch, as though something, or someone, was moving toward me through the void. My heart raced, panic creeping in, but I couldn't move. The silence, the cold, had taken my ability to act, to even think clearly. All I could do was wait. And then, I felt it. A presence behind me. Not a physical feeling, but something that pressed against me from the inside, like a voice in my mind. The tapping stopped. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, and I felt an overwhelming pressure in my skull. The voice that whispered in my mind was no longer distant. It was here. It was inside. You shouldn't have spoken, it said, and I could hear the smile in its words. But you did. And now, you belong. I wanted to scream, to beg for release, but my mouth wouldn't open. The air itself seemed to seal it shut. I was trapped, frozen, unable to fight, unable to speak. There's no escape now, the voice continued. Not for you. Not for anyone who chooses to acknowledge me. Suddenly, the darkness shifted, the cold receding slightly. The weight of the silence lifted just enough for me to feel movement, slow, hesitant movement, around me. A subtle shift in the air, like the very fabric of reality was bending and stretching, making room for something larger, something incomprehensible. The man in the coat appeared before me once more, his figure emerging from the dark like a shadow given shape. His smile was still there, cold and predatory. His eyes, unblinking, locked onto mine, and in them I saw the emptiness. The absence of everything human. You should have never spoken, he repeated, his voice soft but full of finality. But now, you've crossed the line. You've invited me into your world. And now, your world is mine. I wanted to ask why. Why me? Why had I been chosen? But I couldn't. I could feel his presence pressing on my mind, squeezing all the questions out of me. There was nothing left. Nothing but him. He stepped closer, and as he did, the darkness seemed to follow him like a cloak that consumed everything it touched. His form blurred and flickered as if he were more shadow than man. But his gaze was clear. His smile was the last thing I saw before everything else faded away. And then, there was nothing. I woke up. Or, at least, I think I did. It was hard to tell where I was. The room around me was dimly lit, the air heavy and thick. My head was spinning, my body sluggish. I didn't remember how I got here or what had happened before, but I knew one thing for certain. The silence was still with me. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was a weight. A pressure. It surrounded me, suffocated me. And no matter where I turned, no matter how much I looked, I could see no way out. The walls were the same, the room unchanged. But something was different. I wasn't alone. There, in the corner of the room, stood the man in the coat. His eyes met mine, and that cold smile crossed his lips once more. You were never meant to leave, he said, his voice echoing through the stillness. This is where you belong now. And I understood, deep in my bones, that I was part of the silence. A part of him. There was no escape, no running away. I was trapped in his world, where nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing existed except for him and the darkness he brought with him. The tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't faint. It was right next to me, loud, insistent, as if something was tapping on the walls of my mind, trying to break through. I closed my eyes, but I could still hear it. It was the sound of everything being consumed. The sound of the end. And I knew, in that moment, that it would never stop. Have you ever wondered what might be hiding behind a door? The kind of door you walk by every day, the kind that never opens, but somehow feels like it's watching you? What if the door wasn't meant to be closed forever? I'd been living in the same apartment complex for nearly 3 months now. It wasn't the best place, but it wasn't the worst either. Small, old, but quiet, and that was all I really needed. I had my routine, work, home, eat, sleep. The neighbors? I barely noticed them, except for one. The man in apartment 307. He never opened his door, at least not while I was around. And the strangest thing was, I never saw him leave either. In the morning, the hallway was empty, and when I came back from work, the same silence greeted me. The door to 307 always remained shut, like a dark, impenetrable wall. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that maybe he worked late or was a hermit of some kind. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. The more I couldn't ignore the unsettling presence that seemed to hover over the apartment like a dark cloud. I tried not to pay attention, but curiosity had a way of creeping in. It wasn't long before I found myself waiting by the stairwell, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. I'd wait until the hallway was empty, then slip past, always with a quick glance at his door. And always, nothing. No movement. No sounds. Just silence. One evening, as I was walking past, I thought I heard something. A muffled noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was faint, but distinct enough to make my heart race. I froze in my tracks, staring at the door. My hand hovered over the railing, ready to move, but I couldn't. What if I was just imagining things? But then, the sound came again. A scraping, slow and deliberate. It wasn't like the creaking of the building settling or the usual noises that came from other apartments. This was different. It was deliberate. And it was coming from behind that door. I stood there for a few moments, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Something about the noise sent a chill through me, a feeling of dread that I couldn't explain. But it wasn't enough to make me run. Not yet. I tried to shake it off. I had no reason to get involved in whatever was going on behind that door. People had their privacy, right? But no matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, I couldn't. The sound, the silence, the feeling of something hidden from view. It gnawed at me. The next morning, I decided I had to know. I couldn't just live in uncertainty. I couldn't let my mind spin these wild ideas without finding out the truth. So, I waited for the perfect moment. It came in the form of a slip of paper under my door. A note, hastily written, with no signature. It was simple, "He's not what you think." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to make of it. Who could have left it? What did it mean? But I knew one thing for sure, I had to find out more. I had to find out what was behind the door of apartment 307. I couldn't ignore the note. The words echoed in my mind, over and over again, "He's not what you think." What did that mean? Who was he? What could be so secretive about the neighbor that someone would leave me a warning like that? It wasn't just a casual note, it was a plea, a warning, or perhaps even a challenge. That morning, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about the scraping sound I heard the night before and the strange emptiness that surrounded apartment 307. The air felt different, heavier, as though the walls were closing in on me. I thought I could hear faint whispers in the silence of the hallway, but when I turned, there was nothing. I had to find out what was going on behind that door. It was madness, I knew that, but my curiosity had already gotten the better of me. And once curiosity gets its claws in, it's hard to pull back. By noon, I had made up my mind. I would go to apartment 307 and knock. If no one answered, I would wait. I would wait until I could learn something, anything, that would explain the strange feelings, the secrecy, the tension in the air. I walked to the third floor, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. My heart raced and my breath quickened, but I pressed on, determined to uncover whatever lay behind that closed door. As I approached apartment 307, the silence felt heavier, more suffocating. My hand hovered over the door, my fingers trembling, but I forced myself to knock. Once. Twice. Nothing. No sound from inside. No footsteps. No rustling. No response. I waited. I stood there for a full minute, listening, straining to hear anything that would tell me there was someone inside. But the air was still. Dead still. It was almost as if the apartment wasn't just empty, it was forgotten. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it again. The scraping sound. It was quieter this time, almost as if the source of it was moving. Slowly. Closer. I froze. I looked at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. This was insane. I should leave. I should walk away. But before I could even take a step, the door creaked. It was a faint sound, almost drowned by the beating of my own heart. The door opened, just a crack, barely wide enough for me to see inside. The space beyond was dark, too dark. The faint light from the hallway didn't penetrate far enough. But through the small gap, I could see movement. A shadow. I couldn't help myself. I leaned closer, trying to make out what it was. The shadow shifted again, and then the door opened wider, slowly, as though inviting me inside. There was no turning back. Something pulled me forward, an invisible force that I couldn't resist. I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, stale, like the room had been sealed off for years. The smell was strange, like old wood and something decayed. I tried not to breathe too deeply, but the smell seemed to cling to everything. The walls were lined with pictures, faded, yellowing, but there was something odd about them. The faces in the pictures, none of them seemed to have eyes. Just blank spaces where eyes should have been. My stomach turned. I took another step forward, my footfall muffled on the carpeted floor. And that's when I saw it. The man. He was standing in the corner, his back to me, perfectly still. I could just make out his figure in the dim light. He wore an old, tattered coat, the same one I imagined him wearing every time I'd seen his door closed. But his face wasn't visible. It was covered by a dark hood, pulled low over his forehead. For a moment, I stood there, unsure what to do, but then I realized I had to speak. I had to ask him something, anything. Are you all right? My voice sounded far too loud in the silence. The man didn't move, didn't respond. For a moment, I thought he might not even be alive. But then, there was a faint sound. A whisper, barely audible. Why did you come? I took a step back, my heart thudding in my chest. His voice was rasping, like it hadn't been used in years. But something about it made my skin crawl. Something was wrong here. Something was deeply wrong. I heard noises, I stammered, trying to find my voice, trying to understand what I was doing here. I thought I should check. What's going on? There was no response. The silence hung in the air like a weight. Then, finally, he spoke again. You shouldn't have come. It was so soft, so final, that I almost didn't hear it. The whisper seemed to come from all around me, as if the apartment itself were speaking. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if I should run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in the corner, from the dark, empty void where his eyes should have been. I took another hesitant step forward. Then, with a sudden jolt, the man turned toward me, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating veil that wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into the unknown. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if the very air itself had turned against me. But then, a faint sound, like a distant whisper, pierced through the blackness. "Wake up." The voice was chilling, hollow, like it came from the depths of the earth. I struggled to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like they weighed a ton. Slowly, the darkness began to fade, giving way to dim light. My vision was blurry at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out the faint outlines of a room I didn't recognize. I was lying on the floor, my body aching, my head pounding as though it had been hit by something heavy. I pushed myself up, my hands shaking as I reached for the floor to steady myself. The air smelled even worse now, like mold and decay. Where was I? How did I get here? I looked around, trying to orient myself. The walls were close, too close, like the space was constricting, closing in on me. The door to apartment 307 was now shut, sealed tightly, like it had never been opened. But there was no way out, no windows, nothing but the thick, oppressive air and the creeping feeling of something lurking just out of sight. And then I heard it again, the scraping sound. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was louder, closer, like something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. I stood up quickly, my legs weak, unsteady beneath me. I turned toward the corner where I had seen the man, but he was gone. The space he had occupied was empty. The room was silent, save for the scraping that now sounded like footsteps. My breath quickened, my pulse racing. I couldn't just stand here. I needed to leave, to find a way out. But my legs refused to move, frozen in place by the fear that gripped me. The scraping stopped. A new sound filled the room, the slow creak of a door opening. I turned, my heart in my throat, and saw something I wasn't prepared for. The door to the hallway, the one I had just come through, was slowly creaking open, inch by inch, as if it were being pushed by an unseen hand. The air around me grew colder. The temperature seemed to drop rapidly, the chill sinking deep into my bones. I could see my breath now, swirling in the still air like a cloud of mist. I was paralyzed. My body refused to move, but my mind was racing. What was happening? What was in that hallway? I stepped forward, almost involuntarily, my feet moving before my mind could catch up. As I crossed the room, I could feel the oppressive weight of the place pushing against me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward. I reached the doorway. The hallway outside was darker than I remembered, almost as if it had swallowed the light. There were no sounds, no movement. Just that same stifling silence. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, causing me to jump. My heart raced in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had to get out. I had to escape before whatever this place was consumed me too. But then, I saw something. A shadow moving at the end of the hallway. It was tall, too tall. It didn't belong there. The figure was still, its form indistinct, like smoke in the dark. And then I heard the voice again, soft, but unmistakable. "I told you not to come." I froze, my blood running cold. I recognized that voice. It was the man from apartment 307. The shadow at the end of the hallway shifted, growing larger, more defined. It was moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. I turned to run, but my legs betrayed me, unwilling to obey. My breath was shallow, panic rising in my chest as the shadow approached. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any details. It was just a silhouette, a dark figure that seemed to absorb the very light around it. I had to get away. I had to escape. I couldn't stay here. I stumbled backward, my body tense with fear, but my feet wouldn't carry me fast enough. The shadow grew closer, and I felt its presence more than saw it. A heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on me. And then, just as the shadow reached me, it stopped. I froze, barely breathing, unable to move. The air around me seemed to thicken, swirling with an unnatural cold. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the hallway, soft, mocking. "You should have never opened that door," the voice whispered. In that moment, I realized the truth. There was no escaping this. There was no way out. The door had closed behind me, and now I was part of whatever this place had become. Part of the man in apartment 307's world. And there was no returning. Not for me. Not for anyone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. The shadow before me was still, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating every breath I tried to take. The cold had deepened to something unnatural, as if the very air was alive, curling around my skin, drawing me deeper into this nightmare. The voice spoke again, and this time it was closer, so close, I could almost feel its breath on my ear. "You wanted to know." The words slithered into my mind like poison, wrapping themselves around my thoughts. I didn't want to know. I never wanted to know. But I had asked the question, hadn't I? I had crossed the line. The shadow shifted, its form growing even darker, as though it had become part of the walls themselves. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my throat. My mouth felt dry, parched, as though I hadn't spoken in years. The hallway stretched before me, endlessly long, and the man, the shadow, was closing in. It was then that I realized something more disturbing. The hallway, it wasn't real. The walls were flickering like old film, glitching, distorting. They seemed to warp and bend, like they were nothing more than an illusion, a trick of the mind. The longer I stared at them, the less solid they became, as though the entire building was beginning to dissolve around me. And still, the shadow drew closer, its presence like a weight pushing down on my chest. I had to move. I had to escape this place before it consumed me. But my body betrayed me once more. I could feel the floor beneath me change, the familiar tiles giving way to something colder, rougher. I looked down, and to my horror, I realized I wasn't standing on the hallway floor anymore. The ground had turned to stone, black, slick, and uneven, like the surface of some ancient, forgotten ruin. "You've crossed the threshold," the voice whispered. "Now, you belong to it. To me." My pulse hammered in my ears as I stumbled backward, trying to find my balance. The hallway around me was no longer just a corridor. It had become a labyrinth, its walls shifting with every movement, every breath I took. The air tasted like iron, thick and suffocating, and the shadows in the corners of my eyes seemed to twitch, to move. I turned, desperate for any escape, but there was none. The door at the end of the hallway, the door I had seen open before, was gone. In its place was a wall, smooth and featureless, as though the door had never existed. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, the walls narrowing as if closing in on me. I could feel my sanity slipping away. The man, he was here, somewhere in this endless, shifting maze. And I could feel him watching me, waiting for me to break. Why? Why are you doing this? My voice broke as I finally found the strength to speak. A low, rasping laugh echoed around me, as if the sound came from everywhere at once. It reverberated through the very walls. You wanted to know what's behind the door. Now you do. And then, the walls began to pulse. They throbbed, like the beating of a heart, a dark, sick rhythm that matched the pounding of my own heart in my chest. I could feel the building, no, the entire space, breathing. The shadows moved again. The air seemed to warp, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. And then, before me, I saw it. A door. Not the hallway door. Not the one I had come through, but a new door. This one was different. It was ancient, made of dark wood, etched with strange symbols I couldn't understand. It was cracked open, just enough to reveal a sliver of light, a dim, sickly glow that seemed to pulse like it was alive. I knew I shouldn't go near it. I knew that whatever lay beyond that door would be far worse than anything I had already experienced. But my feet, my legs, were moving, pulling me forward. I tried to stop myself, but the force inside me, that invisible pull, was stronger than my will. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open. Beyond it was darkness, darker than anything I had ever seen. But there was something else, something watching from within the black void. Something that breathed with a deep, low, guttural sound. And as I stepped inside, the world around me seemed to dissolve entirely. It was like falling into nothingness. There were no walls. No floor. No light. Just a suffocating, endless void where I felt like I was being pulled in all directions at once. And then, in that crushing silence, I heard it again. You shouldn't have come. The voice was different now, softer, like a whisper in the wind. But there was something else in it, a finality. A darkness that made my blood run cold. The shadows that had once only been glimpses of movement became full forms, surrounding me, closing in. I could feel their cold touch, like fingers made of ice, brushing against my skin. The darkness swallowed me whole, and I realized, too late, that there was no escape. No escape from the man behind the door. And no way out of this labyrinth. When I woke, I wasn't sure where I was. Or when. The familiar hum of the city, the dull rhythm of traffic, wasn't there anymore. There was no light, no warmth, only a thick, suffocating darkness pressing against my skin. My breath was shallow, quick, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, but something in the air felt wrong. It wasn't just the chill. It was the silence. It was too complete. No distant sounds of the street, no hum of the air conditioning, just a hollow, unyielding quiet. I tried to move, but my limbs felt as though they were weighted down by something far beyond simple fatigue. My hands brushed against something soft but unnatural, something like fabric, thick and heavy, tangled around me. I tried to scream, but my voice didn't break the silence. It felt like my throat had been sealed shut. My eyes strained in the blackness, trying to make out shapes, but there was nothing. Only a void that seemed to stretch on forever. Then I remembered. The door. The figure. The maze. I struggled to sit up, the weight on my body pressing harder, dragging me deeper into the stillness. My heart pounded in my chest, panic rising as memories flooded back, fragments of the labyrinth, the endless hallways, the door that led me here. Where was I? What had happened? I tried to move again, and this time I felt something shift beneath me. My hand brushed against cold stone. Slowly, cautiously, I pushed myself up, the sensation of being submerged in something thick, like tar, making every movement feel like wading through water. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my vision cleared and I realized I was in a room. But it wasn't like any room I knew. The walls were made of dark stone, like the inside of an ancient tomb. There were no windows, no doors, just a circular stone chamber, its surface uneven, cracked, and slick with moisture. I stood shakily, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me, but somehow I found the strength to stay upright. My hands pressed against the cold walls for balance. And then I heard it again. A whisper, soft but clear, like the wind passing through an ancient tunnel. You shouldn't have come back. I froze. The voice. It wasn't just a memory anymore, it was real. The same voice that had followed me through the labyrinth, the same voice that had mocked me, that had trapped me. I turned toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Silent. You wanted answers. You wanted to know. The voice came from everywhere, surrounding me, closing in, and I realized then that I was no longer in control. The room was alive with the sound of his voice, his presence, curling around me like a trap I couldn't escape. I staggered backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked at the stone walls again, feeling the weight of their darkness pressing down on me. And then, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, flickering at the edge of my vision, but as it drew closer, it became clearer. The figure. The man from apartment 307. He was standing there, just beyond my reach, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. His presence was overwhelming, no longer just a figure in the shadows, but something tangible, something that filled the room. His stillness was unnerving, and the silence between us felt like a void, an endless pit. He didn't speak at first, but I could feel his gaze upon me, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was paralyzed, caught in the web of his presence. You should never have opened that door, he finally said, his voice deep, hollow, as though it echoed from the very walls themselves. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. No words came. You wanted to know, he continued, his voice growing colder. Now you will know. But it will cost you more than you can understand. The room around me seemed to shift, the stone walls vibrating with the weight of his words. The temperature dropped again, colder than ever, and I could feel the air thickening, pressing against me, pushing me closer to the ground. There's no escape from here, the man said, his voice rising, becoming louder and more distorted. Not for you. Not for anyone. I couldn't breathe. I could feel my chest tightening, my heart beating erratically as the darkness swallowed me whole. The man's shadow moved closer, and I realized with horror that he wasn't just standing there anymore. He was walking toward me, his figure distorting as he came closer, blending with the darkness, becoming part of it. My legs gave way beneath me. I collapsed to the cold stone floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The man loomed over me, his presence overwhelming, his shadow swallowing the last remnants of light. And in that moment, I understood. This place, this nightmare, it was never meant to be escaped. The door had never been the problem. It had been the key to the place where the darkness lived. And now, I was part of it. Forever. The last breath I took was a slow, suffocating exhale, and as I closed my eyes, the void wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into its endless, consuming darkness. There would be no returning. No more searching for a way out. I had crossed the threshold. And now, I would remain. Forever. Have you ever driven the same road every day and suddenly found yourself lost, even though you're sure you've been there before? That's how it started. The strange, disorienting feeling that crept over me as I turned the corner, expecting to see the familiar stretch of highway I knew so well. But when I looked up, I saw something else entirely. A road I had never noticed before, twisting and curving into the trees like it had always been there, waiting for me. I had been driving the same route to work for years, nothing new, nothing unusual. It was a quiet country road, lined with overgrown grass, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. I had passed the same landmarks every morning, the old barn with its rusty roof, the faded sign warning of wildlife, and the endless rows of trees that formed a green tunnel over the asphalt. It was a peaceful drive, a comfort in the monotony of my daily routine. But today was different. It was subtle at first, a shift I couldn't quite place. The road felt narrower, as though it were folding in on itself. The trees, which usually created a steady wall of green, had started to crowd in. The familiar bends and dips of the road had faded, replaced by a sharp turn I didn't remember making. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the road I knew, but only the thick trees and misty fog stared back at me. It was like I had crossed some invisible threshold. I slowed the car, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The road must have been altered for some construction project or detour, but I had never seen any signs. No warnings, no roadblocks. Just the trees, the fog, and that growing sense of unease creeping over me. I continued on, though every instinct told me to turn back. The silence around me felt oppressive, like the air itself had thickened. The trees were now dense on both sides of the road, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if they were holding secrets from an age-long past. And then, I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the haze, I made out the shape of a building. A structure that didn't belong. It was an old farmhouse, or what used to be one, its outline barely discernible against the overgrown landscape. The paint was peeling, the windows dark and empty, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking as though it had been calling out for years. Something about the house felt wrong. My heart skipped a beat, and I considered turning the car around then and there. But the road had already narrowed so much, it was difficult to make a sharp turn without risk of skidding off the edge. I drove closer. The house loomed larger as I approached. But as I got nearer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were no other houses nearby. No barns, no fences, not even the usual rolling fields. Just that single, decaying farmhouse, sitting in isolation. It was as if the entire world had abandoned it, left it to rot. I stopped the car a few yards away from the house. My mind raced. Was this part of the road I had been driving every day? Where was I? How could I have missed this place? There had never been a farmhouse here before. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air felt damp, heavy, as if the fog had seeped into my lungs. The silence was unsettling, too still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. I took a few cautious steps toward the house. My eyes scanned the surroundings, but everything looked strangely unfamiliar. The trees were too dense, the ground too uneven. It was as though I had driven into another world, one where time had no meaning. I reached the steps of the porch, my hand hovering above the railing, unsure whether I should go any further. But something drew me in. Curiosity, or perhaps something darker, urged me forward. I pushed the door open with a creak, the sound echoing in the hollow, deserted space. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, my footsteps unsettling the silence. The house was empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt alive in some twisted way, like the walls were waiting for something or someone. I walked slowly through the dark hallway, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. A picture hung crookedly on the wall, an old family photo, its faces blurred and unrecognizable. The only light came from a small window at the end of the hall, its glass cracked. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, from somewhere deeper inside the house, I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But I was certain it was a voice. "Leave now." I froze. The voice was barely a breath, but it carried with it a sense of urgency, of warning. I turned toward the source, my pulse quickening, but I saw nothing. The house remained as still as it had been when I first stepped inside. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Leave this place. It is not meant for you." My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back toward the door. The floor creaked under my feet, and I felt the air grow colder. The house was closing in around me, its presence suffocating. I didn't need another warning. I turned and bolted out the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air outside felt sharp, biting, as though I had just escaped something unnatural. But when I reached the car, I looked back. The house was gone. I stood frozen by the car, my breath caught in my throat. The house had disappeared, vanished as though it had never been there. In its place was an open field of overgrown grass swaying gently in the breeze. The twisted trees that had lined the road just moments ago now seemed further away, their branches reaching skyward like silent witnesses to my confusion. I gripped the car door, trying to steady myself. My mind raced with questions, each one more irrational than the last. Had I imagined it? Had the stress of routine and monotony finally caught up with me? No, I thought. I knew what I saw. The house had been there, old, decaying, and full of an unnatural, suffocating presence. I climbed back into the car, but as I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine refused to start, clicking once before falling silent. The gas gauge, which had been nearly full earlier, now showed empty. It didn't make sense. I hadn't driven far enough to drain the tank, and there had been no sign of a leak. The fog thickened around me, wrapping the car in a blanket of gray. The familiar landmarks I had seen earlier, the rusty sign, the overgrown barn, were gone. The road stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into the mist. I checked my phone, hoping to use the GPS or call for help, but there was no signal. The screen flickered weakly, then went black. Panic began to creep in, tightening around my chest like a vice. I was alone, stranded, and the world seemed to have shifted into something unrecognizable. I leaned back in the seat, forcing myself to take slow, measured breaths. Think, I told myself. There has to be a way out of this. Maybe if I followed the road, it would lead me back to something familiar, a gas station, a town, anything. Stepping out of the car again, I felt the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though there was no one around. The road beckoned me forward, its surface cracked and uneven. With no other choice, I started walking, the fog closing in tighter with every step. After what felt like hours of walking, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing the outline of another structure in the distance. It wasn't the house I had seen before. This building was smaller, resembling an old roadside diner. The neon sign above it flickered weakly, spelling out a single word, "Open." Relief washed over me. Finally, a sign of life. As I approached, I noticed how out of place it looked. The diner was pristine, as though frozen in time. Its chrome exterior gleamed faintly in the dim light, and the windows were spotless. But there were no cars in the lot, no sign of anyone inside. I pushed open the door, the small bell above it jingling softly. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and soft music played from an old jukebox in the corner. The diner was empty, yet the counters were spotless, the coffee pot steaming as if it had just been made. "Hello?" My voice echoed slightly, the only sound aside from the hum of the jukebox. No response. I stepped further inside, my boots squeaking against the tiled floor. The place felt eerily alive, as if it were waiting for someone, waiting for me. I approached the counter, my eyes scanning for any sign of the staff. A cup of coffee sat on the counter, steam still rising from its surface. Next to it was a single plate with a slice of pie. I hesitated, my stomach growling. It had been hours since I'd eaten, but the thought of touching the food made my skin crawl. It was too perfect, too pristine, as though it had been placed there deliberately. I turned toward the jukebox, the soft melody shifting to something slower, more melancholic. The air grew heavier, the diner suddenly feeling smaller. I glanced at the door, considering leaving, but when I looked back, the coffee cup was gone. I froze. The pie was still there, untouched, but the cup had vanished without a sound. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room. The diner was empty, wasn't it? I backed toward the door, my hand brushing against the handle. But before I could pull it open, the music stopped, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. Then, a voice. Low, calm, and deliberate. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but the diner was still empty. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me like a chilling wind. My hand tightened on the door handle, and I yanked it open, stumbling out into the fog. But the road was gone. In its place was the same field I had seen before, stretching endlessly into the mist. The diner was now behind me, its neon sign flickering more erratically. The once inviting light now seemed to pulse like a warning. I ran. The grass grabbed at my legs as I sprinted into the unknown, the fog thickening with every step. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the world around me twisted and turned, the familiar laws of reality breaking apart. I didn't stop until I could run no more, collapsing onto the damp ground. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my eyes scanning the endless white expanse. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the fog. They were coming toward me. The footsteps drew closer, each one deliberate and measured, crunching against the invisible terrain. I scrambled to my feet, every instinct screaming at me to run again. But my legs refused to move, paralyzed by the icy grip of fear. "Who's there?" I shouted into the mist, my voice shaking. It echoed briefly before the fog swallowed it whole. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then, a whisper, soft and fleeting, carried on the wind like a secret not meant for my ears. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, beckoning, almost mocking. "Stay back," I yelled, stepping backward instinctively. My heel hit something solid, and I stumbled, nearly falling. I turned to see what it was, a signpost, crooked and weathered, its surface peeling with age. The letters were faint, but I could just make out the word, "Welcome." Welcome to what? I didn't know, and I wasn't about to find out. I gripped the post for support, my eyes darting around the fog. The footsteps had resumed, moving in a slow, circular pattern around me, like a predator toying with its prey. "Show yourself," I demanded, but my voice betrayed my fear. A shape began to form in the mist, a dark silhouette, tall and indistinct. It stood still, its presence heavy and suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it, willing it to remain distant. "Why are you here?" The voice was low, almost a growl, and it came from the figure. I didn't mean to, I started, but the words died in my mouth. What could I say? That I'd gotten lost? That the road I'd driven 100 times had betrayed me and led me into this nightmare? The figure stepped closer, and I stumbled back, the signpost creaking under my weight. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice reverberating through the fog like an echo of a forgotten memory. I didn't want to. I shouted, panic taking over. "The road, it brought me here. I don't even know where here is." The figure stopped, tilting its head as if considering my words. The silence stretched unbearably long, and then it spoke again. "This place isn't meant for you," it said. "But now that you're here, you'll have to stay." "No!" I yelled, turning and running without a second thought. My feet pounded against the ground as I sprinted blindly into the fog, desperate to escape. The mist seemed alive, shifting and swirling around me, making it impossible to tell where I was going. Behind me, the footsteps quickened, matching my pace with ease. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, invading my mind and filling it with fragmented, incoherent words. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the voices became deafening. Covering my ears did nothing to block them out. They weren't coming from outside, they were inside my head, clawing at my sanity. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. The fog parted slightly, revealing a clearing ahead. In the center stood a single structure, a small, dilapidated house. It was the same house I'd seen before. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "It's not possible." But there it was, its broken windows staring at me like hollow eyes, its door hanging slightly ajar. The world seemed to hold its breath as I stared at it, the silence even more oppressive than the whispers had been. Behind me, the footsteps came to a halt. "You must go inside," the voice said. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure stood just a few feet away now, its features still obscured by the mist. But there was something familiar about it, something I couldn't place. "I'm not going in there," I said, but my voice wavered. "You have no choice," it replied. "This is the only way." The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the house. As it did, the fog thickened again, swirling around us until the rest of the world disappeared. The road was gone. The diner was gone. There was only the house. And the figure. "You'll understand soon enough," it said. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me shifted, pulling me forward. It wasn't a physical force. There was no wind, no hand pushing me, but I couldn't resist it. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the house. The door creaked open wider as I approached, revealing only darkness inside. "Wait," I pleaded, turning back toward the figure. But it was gone. The whispers returned, softer now, urging me forward. My hand reached out, trembling, and pushed the door open. The darkness swallowed me whole. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, and the world fell into an impenetrable darkness. I spun around, my hands fumbling for the handle, but it was gone. Smooth wood met my fingertips where the door had once been. "Hello?" My voice trembled, swallowed by the void. A faint glow flickered to life, casting dim light across the room. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, patterned with intricate designs that seemed to twist and shift under the flickering illumination. The floor creaked under my hesitant steps, every sound magnified in the oppressive silence. The air was heavy, damp, and carried the faint scent of mildew mixed with something metallic. I moved deeper into the house, drawn by a faint sound. It was subtle at first, a rhythmic tapping, as if someone were drumming their fingers on a table. My breath quickened, and I fought the urge to call it again. Whatever was making that sound, I wasn't sure I wanted its attention. The room opened into a long hallway. Doors lined the walls, some hanging askew, others closed tight. At the far end, a faint light spilled from beneath one of the doors, and the tapping sound grew louder. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself were trying to hold me back. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The light was warm and inviting, almost out of place in the suffocating gloom of the house. But the tapping was sharper now, insistent, like a metronome that demanded my presence. Slowly, I pushed the door open. Inside was a small room, empty save for a single wooden chair sitting in the center. The light came from an old oil lamp on the floor, its flame flickering weakly. But the chair wasn't empty. A figure sat there, slumped forward, its head hanging low. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, breathing. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Excuse me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, each movement deliberate and slow, the floor creaking under my weight. The light from the lamp cast long shadows, warping the shape of the figure into something grotesque and unnatural. When I was close enough, I reached out, my hand trembling. Before I could touch it, the figure snapped upright, its head turning sharply toward me. It had no face. The skin was smooth and featureless, stretched tight over its skull like a mask. But I could feel its gaze, piercing and relentless, boring into me. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. The figure rose from the chair, its movements slow and deliberate, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Why did you come here?" it asked, its voice a hollow echo that reverberated in the room. I don't know," I stammered, my back pressing against the wall. "You were warned," it said, taking a step closer. The light from the lamp began to dim, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. "I didn't mean to." "Curiosity is dangerous," it interrupted, its voice growing louder, more distorted. "This place remembers. It keeps what it takes." The room began to shift around me. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsating with a sickly rhythm. The air grew colder, and a low hum filled the space, growing louder with each passing second. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, and I felt a pull, a force dragging me toward it. "No!" I screamed, fighting against the invisible current. The floor beneath me gave way, and I fell, plunging into darkness. I landed with a thud on cold, wet ground. The air was thick with fog, and the faint sound of whispers surrounded me once more. When I opened my eyes, I was outside the house. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The village was different now. The houses were intact, their windows glowing with warm light, and the streets were bustling with people. But the faces, every person I saw had the same featureless face as the figure in the chair. They turned to look at me, their blank stares filled with an unspoken accusation. I backed away, my chest tightening. "You don't belong here," a voice said from behind me. I turned to see the figure from the chair, now standing tall and imposing. Its presence was suffocating. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You brought yourself here," it said. "And now, you'll never leave." The whispers grew louder, the faceless crowd closing in around me. "No!" I shouted, pushing through the crowd, desperate to escape. The road stretched ahead, illuminated by faint moonlight. I ran, the whispers and footsteps following me, the figure's voice echoing in my mind. "You'll be back," it said, its tone final. As I ran, the fog began to lift, and the road I knew so well came into view. But when I turned back, the village was gone. I staggered onto the familiar road, my breath ragged, heart pounding in my chest. The morning sun was rising, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, as though the horrors of the night had been nothing but a fleeting dream. But it wasn't a dream. I could still feel the cold, damp air of the village on my skin. The whispers echoed faintly in my ears, and the faceless figure's words repeated over and over in my mind, "You'll be back." I climbed into my car, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the road ahead. It looked ordinary now, empty, silent, stretching toward the horizon like it always had. But I knew better. As I drove, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It wasn't working. The screen flickered erratically, the numbers scrambled and unreadable. My phone was no better, its battery was drained, though I charged it fully the night before. The road felt longer than usual, the landscape around me oddly distorted. Trees cast elongated shadows, their branches curling unnaturally as if they were reaching out to grab me. I pressed down on the accelerator, desperate to leave it all behind. When I finally reached home, I slammed the door shut behind me and collapsed onto the couch. The safety of my familiar surroundings was a fragile comfort, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I had escaped. But deep down, I knew the truth. The road had changed me. Days passed, and life seemed to return to normal. The road no longer twisted into unfamiliar paths, and the memory of the village began to feel distant, almost unreal. But the signs were there, small, subtle things that kept me tethered to the nightmare I'd left behind. At night, I would wake to faint whispers, their words indistinct but undeniably present. Shadows in my apartment seemed to linger a moment too long, and the air often felt unnaturally cold. One evening, as I sat at my desk, trying to distract myself with work, a faint knock echoed through the apartment. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. With trembling hands, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see the faceless figure standing on the other side. But the hallway was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. On the floor lay an envelope, its edges frayed and stained. My name was scrawled on the front in jagged handwriting. I picked it up, my heart racing, and tore it open. Inside was a single photograph. It was the village. The houses stood as they had in a dreamlike horror, their windows glowing warmly. But in the center of the photo, the figure from the chair stood motionless, staring directly at the camera. And behind it, blurred but unmistakable, was me. I dropped the photo, my breath hitching. How was this possible? The whispers began again, louder now, filling the room with their haunting chorus. You'll be back. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to close in. The photograph lay at my feet, its edges curling as if burned by an invisible flame. I stumbled back, clutching my head as the whispers grew deafening, drowning out every rational thought. When the lights stabilized, the photo was gone. The room was silent once more, but I knew the message was clear. The road wasn't finished with me. A week later, I found myself driving again. Not by choice, but by some unseen compulsion that gnawed at me relentlessly. I told myself it was to prove that the village wasn't real, that it had all been a product of stress and exhaustion. But as I neared the familiar stretch of road, my heart sank. The fog was back, rolling in thick waves that swallowed the world around me. The air grew cold, and the faint outline of the village emerged in the distance. I stopped the car, gripping the wood tightly. I could turn back. I could fight this. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The road always leads back. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked forward, the whispers welcoming me like an old friend. This time, I wouldn't escape. The village waited, its secrets unfolding with every step I took. And as I crossed the threshold, I realized the truth. The road doesn't just lead to the village. It becomes you. Have you ever walked into your own home and felt like something had changed, something subtle but undeniably wrong? That was exactly how I felt the night I found the door. It started as an ordinary evening. I came home late from work, the dull hum of streetlights following me as I unlocked the front door. My house was quiet, the kind of silence that normally felt comforting. But that night, it was oppressive. I shrugged off my coat, kicked off my shoes, and made my way to the kitchen. As I passed the hallway, something caught my eye, a dark shape where there shouldn't have been one. A door. It was at the end of the hallway, where I'd walked hundreds of times before without ever seeing it. The door was old, its surface scratched and faded as if it had been there for decades. I stood frozen, staring at it. How had I never noticed it before? My logical mind tried to explain it away. Maybe I had just forgotten. Maybe the door had been there all along, blending into the background like an overlooked piece of furniture. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the unease wouldn't leave me. The door didn't belong there. I walked closer, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the narrow hallway. As I reached for the handle, a faint noise stopped me. It was coming from the other side of the door. A soft shuffling sound, like someone moving around. My hand hovered over the handle. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unsteady. The noise stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I backed away, my heart racing. Something about the door was wrong, not just its sudden appearance, but the air around it. It felt colder, the shadows darker, as if the door was drawing the light and warmth away. I told myself not to panic. I checked the other rooms, convincing myself that there was no intruder. The windows were locked, and nothing seemed out of place. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I stood in the hallway, staring at the door again. It hadn't disappeared like I half expected it to. If anything, it looked even more out of place in the daylight. I decided to open it. The door creaked as I turned the handle, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet house. The room beyond was small, dimly lit by a single window that let in a pale, gray light. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. There was nothing in the room except an old chair in the center, its wood splintered and worn. Dust coated the floor, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading from the door to the chair. My footprints. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't stepped into the room yet, but the footprints were there, perfectly matching the soles of my shoes. I stepped back, closing the door with trembling hands. For the next few days, I avoided the door. I tried to act like everything was normal, like I wasn't living in a house with an impossible room. But the room didn't let me forget. At night, I heard noises, soft whispers, faint creaks, the sound of something shifting inside. During the day, I noticed small things out of place, a picture frame slightly askew, a chair moved a few inches from its usual spot. And then there was the smell. It started faint, barely noticeable, but it grew stronger each day. A metallic, acrid scent that seemed to seep out from under the door, clinging to the air no matter how much I tried to ignore it. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't explain it, but every time I walked past the door, I felt eyes on me, unseen, unblinking, always there. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside the house. I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding. The sound moved slowly, deliberately, from the hallway toward my bedroom. And then it stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything in the suffocating silence. A soft knock came from the other side of the bedroom door. The knock wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, 3 soft raps that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My body refused to move, every muscle frozen in place. I waited in the dark, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of my heart. Nothing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually, I gathered the courage to move. My hand trembled as I reached for the bedside lamp, the faint click of the switch louder than I expected. The warm glow filled the room, chasing away the shadows, but the fear didn't leave me. I stared at the bedroom door. It was closed, just as I had left it before going to bed. Was it a dream? The thought offered little comfort. I slid out of bed, my bare feet brushing against the cold floor, and moved toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, holding my breath. Silence. Slowly, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The hallway was empty, bathed in faint moonlight filtering through the living room window. And then I saw it. The door at the end of the hallway was open. It wasn't wide open, just a crack, enough to let a sliver of darkness spill into the hallway. My stomach turned. I knew I had closed it. I stepped forward, each movement deliberate, my breath shallow. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, revealing the room beyond. It was the same as before, the old chair in the center, the faint light filtering through the window. But now, there was something else. A mirror. It was large, leaning against the far wall, its ornate frame chipped and tarnished. The glass was cloudy, streaked with faint smudges that looked almost like fingerprints. I didn't remember seeing it before. I stepped into the room, my eyes fixed on the mirror. As I approached, the air grew colder, the metallic smell stronger. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but something felt off. I leaned closer, inspecting the glass. And then I saw it. Behind me, in the reflection, a shadow moved. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. I left the room, shutting the door firmly behind me. This time, I locked it. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of traffic, felt amplified, unnatural. By morning, I had convinced myself that I was imagining things. Stress, lack of sleep, it all made sense. But deep down, I knew the room was wrong. That day, I stayed out of the house as long as I could. Work, errands, anything to keep me from going home. But eventually, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I had no choice. When I walked through the front door, the smell hit me immediately. It was stronger now, almost suffocating. The metallic tang was sharp, mixed with something earthy and damp, like rotting wood. The hallway felt darker than usual, the light bulb casting a dim, flickering glow. My eyes were drawn to the door at the end, which seemed to loom larger than before. I tried to ignore it, heading straight to the living room. I turned on every light in the house, but brightness doing little to ease my nerves. But the door wouldn't let me forget. As I sat on the couch, trying to focus on the noise of the television, I heard it again, a faint shuffling sound coming from the room. My stomach tightened. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never come back, but something held me there. Curiosity. Or maybe it was something else. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The chair was gone. The mirror was still there, but its surface was no longer cloudy. It was clear now, painfully so, and what I saw in it made my blood run cold. The room in the reflection wasn't empty. There was someone standing behind me. I froze, unable to breathe, my eyes locked on the figure in the mirror. It was tall, its outline barely distinguishable from the shadows in the room. Its face was obscured, features lost in a darkness that didn't belong to the dimly lit space. A hand, a pale, thin hand, reached out toward me in the reflection. My instinct screamed to turn around, but I couldn't. My legs were rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed by fear. And then it spoke. Not out loud, but inside my head, a low, whispering voice that seemed to echo in every corner of my mind. Why are you here? The words sent a jolt through me, breaking the spell. I stumbled backward, my gaze darting between the mirror and the empty space behind me. Nothing was there. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at my own reflection, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Eventually, I forced myself to move, shutting the door to the room and retreating to my bedroom. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house felt deliberate, every gust of wind against the windows a whisper of something trying to get in. Morning brought no relief. The metallic smell lingered, seeping into every corner of the house. I avoided the room at the end of the hallway, even though it felt like its presence was pulling me closer, a silent invitation I couldn't ignore. By the time the sun set again, I had convinced myself that I needed to confront whatever was happening. Running away wouldn't help, not from something that seemed determined to follow me, even into my thoughts. Armed with a flashlight and a resolve I wasn't sure I truly felt, I approached the door once more. The air grew colder as I reached it, and for a moment, I hesitated. But the quiet hum of the house seemed to push me forward, urging me to turn the handle and step inside. The mirror was gone. In its place, the chair had returned, now positioned in the center of the room. On the seat was something that hadn't been there before, a piece of paper. I moved closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I illuminated the note. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, as though written in a hurry. It read, "Stay out. It's not for you." My breath caught in my throat. I picked up the paper, turning it over in my hands, but there was nothing else. Just those chilling words. As I stood there, a sound broke the silence, a faint creaking, like the groan of old wood under pressure. It was coming from the walls. The noise grew louder, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath me. I backed toward the door, my heart racing, but before I could leave, the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the corners warping, the edges blurring. The chair scraped against the floor, moving on its own, turning to face me. And then the door slammed shut. Panic set in as I grabbed the handle, twisting and pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew darker, the air thicker, as though it was being drained of light and sound. Behind me, I felt it, a presence, heavy and suffocating. I didn't want to turn around, but something compelled me to. The chair was no longer empty. Sitting there, perfectly still, was a figure. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes, two pinpricks of cold light, bored into me. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, its voice low and fractured, like the sound of breaking glass. I pressed myself against the door, my fingers fumbling for the lock. The figure didn't move, but the walls seemed to close in further, the space shrinking with every passing second. Finally, the lock gave way, and I stumbled out into the hallway. When I turned back, the door was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the familiar contours of my home twisted into something alien. Every door, every piece of furniture had vanished, leaving me in an empty, featureless corridor. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, I heard the sound of footsteps. They were coming closer. The footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, reverberating through the endless hallway. Each step sent a shiver down my spine, my breath shallow and rapid as I pressed myself against the nearest wall. I wanted to run, but the corridor seemed to stretch forever in both directions. No doors, no windows, nothing to mark an escape. The footsteps grew louder, closer. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling, barely audible over the rhythmic sound. No answer. The shadows along the walls seemed to ripple, as though they were alive, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the encroaching darkness. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged from the gloom. It moved slowly, its form indistinct, like a smudge on a glass pane. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure didn't stop. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor, my pulse racing. The corridor stretched on endlessly, the walls narrowing, the air growing colder with every step. Behind me, the footsteps quickened, matching my pace. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted something ahead, a faint light, a door shimmering faintly in the oppressive dark. My heart leapt, a fragile hope pushing me forward. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I reached the door and threw it open, stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind me. Silence. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, sweat dripping down my face. The room I had entered was small, almost claustrophobic. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a single object, the chair from the strange room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The chair was empty, but the air around it felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. The door behind me rattled, the handle twisting violently. "No," I whispered, backing away. The rattling stopped. And then, the voice came again, soft and cold, whispering directly into my mind. "You can't leave." The room began to shift, the walls bending and distorting, the ceiling collapsing inward. The chair scraped across the floor, moving toward me. I pressed myself against the far wall, my hands searching for something, anything, to defend myself. But there was nothing. The chair stopped, its legs creaking under an invisible weight. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the dim light. And then, I saw them. Handprints, pale, ghostly handprints, pressed against the walls, appearing one by one, surrounding me. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though something unseen was trying to claw its way through. The voice returned, louder now, resonating through the room. "You opened the door. Now you belong here." Panic consumed me. I lunged for the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in, the handprints growing larger, more frantic. I turned back to the chair, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. A figure sat there, its form barely human, its face a void of shifting shadows. It reached out toward me, its fingers impossibly long, claw-like. "Take a seat," it whispered. I shook my head, my entire body trembling. "Take a seat," it repeated, its voice echoing, relentless. I screamed, slamming my fists against the door, pleading for it to open. The figure rose from the chair, its movements slow and deliberate, its presence overwhelming. The walls began to dissolve, the room melting into an endless void. And then, everything went black. I awoke on the floor of my hallway, the faint morning light streaming through the windows. My heart raced as I looked around, my body trembling with the residual terror of the night before. The house was silent, the strange room gone. But as I sat there, trying to calm myself, I felt it, the faint imprint of a hand on my shoulder, cold and unyielding. And in the distance, barely audible, came the sound of footsteps. I didn't leave the house that morning. I couldn't. My legs were too weak to carry me, and my mind was too clouded by the night's horrors. I sat in the corner of my living room, clutching my knees to my chest, staring at the hallway where the strange room had appeared. The handprint on my shoulder still felt cold, a phantom sensation that refused to fade. I wanted to believe it was over, that the room was gone for good. But deep down, I knew better. By midday, I'd forced myself to move. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt false, its warmth unable to touch the icy fear that gripped me. I checked every corner of the house, every room, every closet. Nothing. But when I opened the door to the guest bedroom, my heart stopped. The chair was there. It stood in the middle of the room, its presence unnatural, wrong. I backed away, my pulse quickening, but something caught my attention, something new. On the floor beneath the chair was a folded piece of paper. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. But curiosity, that fatal flaw, won out. With trembling hands, I picked up the paper and unfolded it. 2 words were scrawled across the page, written in jagged, uneven letters. "Sit down." I dropped the note and stumbled back, my chest tightening. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The chair seemed to shift, its position subtly changing, as though it were leaning toward me. I bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. But as I turned, I froze. The chair was now in the hallway. I ran to the front door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't open. The handle refused to turn, as though it were welded in place. Every window, every exit, blocked, sealed, unyielding. The house had become a prison, and the chair was following me. It appeared in every room I entered, always waiting, always watching. No matter how fast I moved, it was always one step ahead. By nightfall, I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind fraying at the edges. And then, the voice returned. "You can't run," it whispered, echoing through the house. I turned to face the chair, my fear giving way to desperation. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, my voice cracking. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the chair slid forward, stopping just a few feet from me. The message was clear. With no other options, I approached the chair, my legs trembling. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as though the entire house was holding its breath. I sat down. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, the world shifted. The walls dissolved, the floor vanished, and I was plunged into an endless void. Shapes and shadows swirled around me, whispers filling my ears, too many voices to comprehend. The chair held me in place, its grip unyielding. And then, amidst the chaos, a figure emerged. It was the same figure from the night before, its form a mass of shadows and shifting darkness. "You're home now," it said, its voice cold and final. I tried to scream, to move, to fight, but it was useless. The void closed in, swallowing me whole. And just like that, I was gone. The house stood silent and empty, its windows dark, its secrets hidden once more. But in the guest bedroom, the chair remained. Waiting. Always waiting. Have you ever stumbled upon something so strange that it made you question everything you knew about reality? Something that makes you wonder if you should have left it untouched, left it forgotten? I never thought that would happen to me. But it did. I was cleaning out my late grandfather's attic when I found it. At first, it looked like any other old piece of forgotten junk, an old cassette recorder, covered in dust, the plastic a bit scratched, as if it had seen better days. I don't know why I decided to press play. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the silence that filled the attic, too thick to ignore. The recorder clicked, then a voice filled the space around me. "Tomorrow, you will find the key. It will lead you to the truth, but beware, the truth will not be kind." I froze. I couldn't even move. The voice was too familiar. Too close. It sounded like mine. I hit the stop button immediately. My heart raced. What was that? I was certain I had never heard that before. It was clear, unsettling. The words felt too real, too deliberate. I set the recorder down, the old tape continuing to spin, taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just been revealed to me. Something I wasn't ready for. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just some recording from the past, not meant for me. But when I picked the recorder back up and pressed play again, the voice was there. It's almost time. The key is closer than you think. Don't let it slip away. This time, the message was clearer, almost as if it was urging me to act. And that's when I realized something chilling. Each time I played the tape, the voice spoke with more certainty, as if it knew exactly what I was doing. I started paying attention. The voice seemed to predict my every move. If I decided to go out for a walk, the recorder would play a message about my path, the places I would visit. A few days later, I found myself standing in front of an old bookstore, the one I hadn't planned on visiting. As I walked inside, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. There was a small shelf in the corner, almost hidden, filled with dusty old books. And on that shelf, just sitting there, was a key. It looked old, like it belonged to a different era. My hand reached out for it, almost on its own accord. That's when the voice spoke again, clearer than ever. The key will open the door to what you seek. But you must be careful, for what you find may never let you go. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I should have stopped right there, left the key where it was and walked away. But the voice had already planted the seed of curiosity in my mind. I took the key and left the bookstore. The moment I stepped outside, I realized something had changed. The world felt different, as if the very air had shifted. I couldn't explain it, but it was like a pressure had begun to weigh on me. The streets seemed quieter, and even the sounds of the city felt muffled. The key was in my pocket, burning against my leg, as though it was demanding to be used. I had to know what it opened. That night, I found myself standing before the door in my apartment that I had never noticed before. It was tucked away behind a bookshelf, a door I could not recall ever seeing in all my time living there. The key fit perfectly into the lock. I turned it, feeling the resistance give way as the door creaked open. I had never felt more terrified in my life. But it was too late to turn back. What lay behind that door was something I never could have imagined. I stepped into the room, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. The door had opened without a sound, but the air inside was thick with something I couldn't describe. It was as though the room had been sealed off for years, untouched by time. Dust hung in the air, dancing in the faint light filtering through a small, grimy window. The room itself was small, no more than a closet, but what struck me was the feeling of presence in the space. It was as though I was not alone. I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were no furniture pieces, no decor, just an old, wooden chair sitting in the center of the room. But then, I saw it. On the chair, there was a small object, almost as if it had been placed there just for me to find. It was a notebook, its cover weathered and torn. I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. The moment I touched the notebook, the voice on the recorder echoed in my mind, "You've opened the door. But what lies beyond is not meant for you." My hands trembled as I flipped open the first page. It was filled with notes, scribbled, frantic words that seemed to flow from someone's mind in a hurry. And then, something chilling caught my eye, my own name, written in the same hurried scrawl. The notes were about me. There were details I couldn't explain, things that hadn't happened yet, things that no one but I could know. It felt like someone had been watching me, recording my every move, every thought. The room seemed to grow colder as I read on. One page was dedicated to the next day, as if this mysterious person knew exactly what I would do. I read the words out loud, a whisper of disbelief escaping my lips. "Tomorrow, you will take the long way home. And when you reach the abandoned factory, you will know what must be done." I dropped the notebook, the sound of it hitting the floor reverberating in the silence. My heart began to race. The factory, it was just outside of town, a place I hadn't thought about in years. I didn't remember making plans to go there, but now the idea felt like an undeniable pull. Something inside me told me I had to go. I had no choice. I slammed the door behind me, the key still in my hand. I didn't even know why I kept it. It felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. As I walked out of the apartment, the city seemed quieter than usual. The streets felt wrong, almost unreal, as if the world around me was shifting, changing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the voice from the recorder in my head, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I couldn't control. The notebook had given me a glimpse of a future I didn't want to face. The next morning, I drove. The drive was uneventful, but my heart pounded the entire way. When I reached the factory, the sense of dread was overwhelming. The old building loomed ahead, its broken windows staring out like empty eyes. The moment I stepped onto the property, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation that I was no longer alone. It wasn't just the factory. It was the entire town, the whole world around me. It felt different, distorted. The air was thicker, the ground beneath me too solid, too heavy. The world had shifted in ways I couldn't understand, and I was caught in the middle of it. I walked toward the entrance, my legs moving on their own. I knew something awaited me inside, and I couldn't stop myself from going further. Then, as I stepped into the shadow of the factory, the recorder's voice returned, filling my mind once more. You've come this far, but there's no turning back now. You've made your choice, and now you must face what you've awakened. I didn't know what that meant, but I felt the weight of those words press against me. The door creaked open in front of me, as though it had been waiting for me to enter. And so, I stepped into the darkness, knowing that whatever I was about to face would change everything. The air inside the factory was thick with dust and decay. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than the last, the sound of my footsteps bouncing off the cold, concrete walls. The place felt alive in a way I couldn't describe, like it was breathing, watching me as I moved through its dark corridors. I followed the winding path, my feet moving almost instinctively. There were no lights in the factory, only shafts of dim sunlight streaming through the broken windows. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was waiting for me, something I wasn't meant to find. As I passed by a row of rusted machinery, I noticed a faint sound coming from deeper within the factory, a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening carefully. The noise was distant, but unmistakable. I took a cautious step forward, drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame. My hands trembled as I clutched the recorder in my pocket. The voice from the recorder, kept echoing in my mind, urging me forward, whispering warnings that grew harder to ignore. "You're getting closer," it said, in that same calm, chilling tone. The factory seemed endless, its corridors twisting in unnatural ways. I didn't recognize anything anymore. Each hallway was a maze of shadows and dust, and the further I walked, the more the air seemed to grow heavier. It felt suffocating, like I was being pulled into something far deeper than just a building. I rounded a corner, and then I saw it. At the far end of the hall was a door, half open, with a faint light flickering from within. The tapping sound was louder now, coming from behind the door. My heart raced. I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run as far away as possible. But I didn't. I reached for the door handle, and just before I opened it, the recorder's voice spoke again, this time clearer, as if it was coming from right behind me. "Do you understand now?" it asked. "This is where it all ends. And it all begins." I couldn't bring myself to look back, but I knew I was no longer alone. There was something in the room, something waiting for me to open the door. I hesitated for a moment, and then, without another thought, I pushed the door open. The light inside flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. The room was small, but its contents sent a chill down my spine. There, sitting in the middle of the room, was an old wooden chair. And sitting on the chair was a figure. The figure was hunched over, its face hidden in shadow. The tapping sound had stopped, replaced by eerie silence. I couldn't move. I could only stare at the figure, unable to make sense of what I was seeing. It was as if the room itself had frozen in time, waiting for something. The figure suddenly shifted, its head turning slowly toward me. It was then that I realized it wasn't just a person. It was me. I gasped and stumbled backward, the door slamming shut behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible scene in front of me. How could that be me? How could I be standing in that chair, staring at myself, as if I had been waiting for this moment? Then, in the silence, the voice from the recorder returned, now unmistakably urgent. "It's too late. You've already changed the future." I tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't escape. The room seemed to close in around me, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that everything I had done, everything I was about to do, had already been written. And the worst part? The worst part was that I couldn't remember the moment I'd become trapped in this endless cycle, this loop where the past and future no longer made sense. The door in front of me creaked open once more, and the figure, I stood up. It took a slow step toward me, its shadow swallowing everything in its path. I couldn't move. I couldn't run. I was caught in the web of my own future, a future I hadn't chosen but had somehow already sealed. Then the door slammed shut again, and I heard only silence. When I woke, I was back in my apartment as if nothing had ever happened. The sounds of the city, the hum of traffic outside my window, all seemed strangely normal. But I knew that nothing was the same anymore. I stared at the recorder, still clutched tightly in my hand. The device had stopped recording, the screen now blank. I had no idea how long I'd been out, but the image of the factory, the figure, me, was burned into my mind, refusing to let go. I glanced around my apartment, trying to find some shred of normalcy, something to prove that I hadn't crossed some kind of line I could never come back from. The walls, the furniture, the floor, everything looked exactly as it had before I stepped into that factory. But the air felt different. Heavier. The voice on the recorder still echoed in my head, its words lingering in my thoughts like a sinister echo. "You've already changed the future." But how? How could I have possibly done that? How could something so small, so seemingly insignificant, have such a terrifying ripple effect? I looked down at the recorder again. I needed answers. I couldn't stop now. I had to know what was happening, even if it was driving me further into madness. There had to be more to this, something I was missing. I pressed play. The first thing I heard was my own voice. It was calm, too calm, like I had recorded this deliberately, as though I knew what was coming. "This is your last chance," the voice said. "You can't stop it. You've already been marked. Everything you do from here on out will only bring you closer to what's coming." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as though the voice was speaking to me from inside my own mind. My own voice, but not mine. Not really. I slammed the recorder down on the table, trying to stop it from continuing, but it wouldn't stop. The voice just kept speaking, its words flowing like a current I couldn't escape. "Open the door," it said, now more urgent. "You must face it. You've been through this before. You will again." It wasn't just a recording anymore. It was like a message. A prophecy, if you will. The words bled into my thoughts, and I couldn't ignore them. I had to go back to the factory. I had to find that door again, the one that had led me to myself. But why? Why was it all leading back to that room? To that figure? I couldn't answer any of these questions. I didn't want to. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting whatever was coming to me pass by, was unbearable. I had to go back. I had to face it. As I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, a sense of dread washed over me, but I couldn't turn back. Every step I took felt as though it was pushing me further into the unknown, into the cycle I was beginning to understand but could not control. The road to the factory seemed different this time, as though it had changed again. The buildings, the landmarks I had passed 1,000 times, now looked foreign. There were no cars, no people. It was as if the city itself had abandoned me, leaving only this path, this predestined road that I was now bound to follow. I reached the factory, the air heavy with a feeling of inevitability. The door stood open, waiting for me. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The sound of my breath was all I could hear in the silence that enveloped me. It was the same as before. The same dusty corridors, the same dim light filtering through broken windows. The tapping noise was back, distant but growing closer. My hands trembled, but I pressed forward, my feet carrying me as if I had no other choice. The factory was no longer just a place. It had become a part of me, a twisted extension of the future that was now unfolding. Every step I took felt like a decision I had made long before I ever set foot in this place. Every hallway seemed to twist in on itself, leading me toward that inevitable door, the one I had seen in my vision, the one where I would finally face the truth. And then, just as I reached it, I heard the voice again, clearer than ever. "You've come to the end." I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. And there it was. Me. Sitting in the same wooden chair, just like before. But this time, I knew what would happen next. It was no longer a question of what I was supposed to do. It was a question of whether I could escape it. The figure stood, turned to face me, and smiled. A smile that mirrored my own. And in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. No way out. I had already crossed the point of no return. The recording clicked off, and the factory went silent. I froze. The smile on the figure's face, the one that was my face, made the air feel suffocating, as though the very atmosphere had been pressed down on me. Every breath I took was harder than the last. My heart pounded in my chest, and my thoughts screamed in frantic confusion, trying to understand, trying to make sense of it all. I should have been terrified, and I was. But there was something else, something even more unsettling. Familiarity. I had been here. I had done this before, in some way. The factory, the chair, the door, it was all part of something I couldn't escape, something I had been walking toward for who knows how long. I had already known how this would play out, and yet every part of me wanted to fight it. I wanted to run, to leave this place and forget everything, but my feet refused to move. My body was frozen, trapped by the invisible force that had guided me here. The figure, it wasn't just a mirror of me anymore. It was me. Or at least, it felt like me. It was me from the future, the version of myself who had walked down this same road, entered this same factory, and accepted what was coming. "You're too late," the figure said, its voice, my voice, calm and certain, as though it had all the answers. "You can't stop what you've started. Everything you've done has led you here. It's all a part of the plan." The plan. The words sent a shiver down my spine, like a cold hand brushing against my skin. The idea that this wasn't just an accident, that this wasn't some random twist of fate, it was planned. But planned by who? By what? "You think you have a choice," the figure continued, its eyes never leaving mine, "but the truth is, you've already made it. The recording, the path you took, none of it was random. It's all connected." I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. But my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I could only watch as the figure reached for something on the desk beside it, a small, dusty recorder. The same recorder I had found in my apartment. I knew what was coming. It pressed play, and my voice filled the room. "This is your last chance," the recording echoed, the same words it had spoken before. But now, they felt different. Darker. Like a warning I could no longer ignore. "I can't stop it," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but the figure heard me. "No," it said, its expression softening into something almost pitying. "You can't stop it. You never could." The weight of its words hit me like a physical blow. I understood, then, what had happened. The future, the past, the recordings, everything had been leading to this moment. I had become trapped in a loop, a cycle I couldn't break. The factory, the recordings, the conversation with myself, it was all a consequence of my own actions. I had unknowingly set this in motion, and now there was no way out. I thought about everything that had happened, the strange occurrences, the recordings that predicted my actions, the way reality seemed to bend and twist around me. It had all been part of a bigger picture, something beyond my understanding, and now I was facing it, in the form of this future version of myself. I looked at the figure, the mirror of my own face, and realized it wasn't just the future I was facing. It was myself. "You're me," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Yes," the figure replied, nodding slowly. "And you are me. We are one. We always have been." The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing on me as the full weight of the truth settled over me. There was no escape. There had never been an escape. The figure stepped forward, extending its hand toward me. "Join me," it said, its voice inviting yet terrifying. "This is your destiny. We've been walking toward this moment from the very beginning." I looked at the hand, the reflection of myself in those outstretched fingers, and I knew, deep down, that I had no choice. I reached out, my hand trembling as I accepted my fate. The factory, the recordings, the endless loop, it was all part of who I was now. And as my fingers touched the figures, the world around us began to change. The factory faded, and in its place, I saw only darkness. The darkness stretched on, infinite and unyielding, and in that darkness, I could hear the faintest whisper. "You've become a part of the story," it said. "And now, there's no going back." The recorder clicked off, and the darkness closed in. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.